Good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here in Hong Kong with you this morning. I want to thank the Center for Evidence-Based Practice and Hong Kong HKSYU University for inviting me here. This is my first trip to Hong Kong, and I have to confess that there were several people back home in California who told me I shouldn't come to Hong Kong, that it was too dangerous. But in fact, I spent the whole day exploring the city yesterday, and the worst thing that happened to me was that I didn't make it through all the list of all the things that I wanted to see. So no danger at all. In fact, it might be a little more dangerous back home because a lot of the state of California is on fire right now, unfortunately. So what I'm going to talk about today is, rather than looking at evidence-based practice as a subject in itself, I'm going to try to marshal evidence both in the United States and internationally about a topic that has held my interest ever since I was in graduate school. I actually wrote my dissertation on a related subject, and that's the distribution of teachers and who teaches whom and where. What types of children have what types of teachers, and what the matching is like. In terms of evidence that I marshal, full disclosure, most of the research that I'll be citing here comes from peer-reviewed scholarly journals in education, but one peer-reviewed book and I'll be talking about a few reports as well. And I will try to be aware, given Professor Clinton's comments on teachers, I will try to be aware of speaking slowly, and I'll try to get under that 171 word per minute threshold. But I'll also note that I just drank some coffee, so I'm a little amped up right now with the coffee, but I'll do my best. So in terms of what I'll be talking about, first I want to establish that this is an important topic to begin with. I'll talk a little bit about the importance of teacher quality and evidence around those questions. And then I'll really focus on the problem of what economists call teacher sorting and unequal access of children to qualified teachers, which turns out this is actually an international problem. We find in most of the countries we've studied, we find some evidence of teacher sorting that really increases inequity especially for marginalized children. And then I will draw on limited evidence about ensuring that every child has a qualified teacher, and I'll be drawing again from international research. So to begin with, are teachers important? Of course they're important. I think we all intuitively believe that teachers are important. Any of us who have been teachers know that to be true, but since this conference is about evidence-based practice, I will look into the evidence a little bit about the importance of teachers. So the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in 2005 did a big study of teachers across dozens of countries. They sent country research teams to many countries. They gathered information about teacher preparation, about teacher career paths, and they did a big review of literature related to teachers and teacher quality. This report was called Teachers Matter, and these were their three broad conclusions from that research that they did. The largest source of variation in student learning is attributable to differences in what students bring to school, their abilities and attitudes, and family and community background. So in terms of how well students do in school, a big fraction of that performance is based on what the conditions are like in their home, the parents of their the education of their parents, occupation of their parents, income of their parents, socioeconomic status. All of that bears a big influence on how well students do in school. But that doesn't mean that schools don't play a role. Of those variables which are potentially open to policy influence, in other words, what are the things that education policymakers can do to improve student outcomes? It's very difficult for education policymakers, for example, to influence what's happening in the home or to influence parental education. But of those things that education policymakers can do, factors involving teachers and teaching are the most important influences on student learning. So teachers are the most important school-related factor for explaining how well students do in school. But here's the problem. There is little consensus about the correlates of teacher quality. What is it about teachers that is important? Is it their education? Is it their experience? Is it their dispositions? There's kind of at least in the economics of education literature, sort of a mystery of that some economists have actually labeled the mystery of teacher quality, about what it is about teachers that's important. So in terms of the characteristics of teachers that I'll be talking about, usually in the research that we use and the data that we use, we have measures like teachers' educational background, their experience. Sometimes we have measures of teacher knowledge or teachers' attitudes. So we don't have really fine-grained measures for the most part about teacher dispositions, for example, some of the measures that Professor Clinton was talking about earlier. But nonetheless, these characteristics, particularly teacher education and experience, are important in terms of the distribution of teachers with those characteristics, simply because they represent resources. Around most of the world, teachers are paid according to their education and experience. So if more educated and more experienced teachers are working with more advantaged students, that represents a real resource inequality, a real inequitable allocation of resources. So some more evidence specifically about the importance of teachers and teacher quality. And these are studies done, econometric studies done by, for the most part, economists. Some of the research has moved a little bit, but I think most of these conclusions still hold. Children who move from an average teacher to a teacher at the 85th percentile of teacher quality can improve by more than 4 percentile rankings in a year, an equivalent effect of reducing class size by 10. So in other words, if you have an average teacher, but then you change to a teacher who's way above average in terms of their impact on student test score growth, you can increase your learning quite a bit in a given year. And now, why do economists compare interventions like this to class size, to reducing class size? They are often doing sort of cost-benefit analyses, and they compare a lot of educational interventions to class size simply because class size is a pretty expensive intervention, because reducing class size because you have to hire more teachers and you often have to equip more classrooms or build more classrooms. So variations in teacher quality explain between 7.5% and 8.5% of total variation in student achievement, a far greater amount than any other school level input. So more than, for example, investments in school infrastructure, school equipment, learning materials, educational leaders, the investments in teachers seem to explain, or the variations in teachers seem to explain the most in terms of student achievement. And really, a really important point for those of us concerned with educational equity and achievement gaps: a disadvantaged student who has 5 successive teachers who are 1 standard deviation above the mean in teacher quality can nearly overcome the mean difference in achievement resulting from being from a disadvantaged population. So in other words, disadvantaged children, economically disadvantaged children who have a long string of very qualified teachers can actually catch up with more advantaged students in terms of their achievement. Now, this is good news in a way, but knowing what we do about teacher distribution, it's very unlikely that economically disadvantaged child will actually have access to a long string of very qualified teachers due to the problem of teacher sorting and unequal access to qualified teachers. So what is this problem that I'm talking about in terms of unequal teacher distribution? So not just in the United States, most of the research on this question has been conducted in the United States. And we know from this research that the situation is really unequal. We know consistently that disadvantaged students, students from underrepresented populations have less access to qualified teachers along many different dimensions of teacher quality or teacher characteristics. But we're also finding that we're finding this internationally and comparatively as well, that across the globe, highly qualified teachers are disproportionately concentrated in better resource schools with higher achieving and more advantaged students. Now, something that's even more concerning, in my opinion, is we're also now finding evidence, as we're looking within schools, evidence of uneven teacher distribution across classrooms within schools. So there's this kind of micro-political process that's happening within schools wherein the more experienced teachers often have a selection of their classes, and they often choose the higher achieving classes or the classes with gifted or advanced students. So this as I said earlier, this unequal distribution leads to important both achievement inequality and resource inequality between more and less advantaged students. Now, in terms of the sources of this unequal teacher distribution, what is causing it? Economists in the United States often attribute this problem to teacher sorting. In other words, more qualified teachers, teachers with more options, choose the better resources schools or higher achieving classrooms. But there's also a role for education policy and practice to either exacerbate these problems or to ameliorate them. But actually, a lot of studies have described this problem, but not many studies have directly examined the causes or remedies for unequal teacher distribution. So that's where I really want to focus in terms of what the evidence tells us. But let me first start with a study. So I mentioned that in graduate school, I was really interested in this question of teacher sorting. So my dissertation topic was about Mexico. I do a lot of work in Latin America on education. And I looked at 2 states in Mexico, a very small state in the center of Mexico called Aguas Calientes, which means hot water in Spanish. And then I looked at a state in the north of Mexico called Sonora, which is right on the border with the United States, with the state of Arizona. And I thought, well, I thought that I would find big differences in teacher patterns of teacher attributes across these two states, a very small state and a big state with vast kind of rural expanses and desert and mountains. But in fact, I found pretty similar results across these 2 states. So what you see in these red boxes, in each of the 2 tables, this top table is the state of Aguas Calientes, and the bottom box is the state of Sonora. And those red boxes represent teacher characteristics in urban schools, and the columns that are not don't have boxes are rural areas. And across much of Latin America, including Mexico, the big difference, the big source of inequality is urban-rural differences. And so I examined some key teacher attributes like teachers' educational attainment, their experience, how they did on training evaluations, and I actually had data on teachers' test scores because they had to take a test for this national teacher incentive program. And I found pretty consistently differences. You can see all those asterisks in both columns in red, pretty significant differences between urban and rural areas in terms of teacher education, teacher experience, teacher test scores. Another interesting finding was that teachers in rural areas are much more likely to be male than teachers in urban areas. So you see this pattern where in remote rural schools, most of the teachers are men. And I won't talk too much about the issue of teacher gender, but this is a really important consideration if we think about educational attainment for girls and girls in rural areas having access to female role models with a high degree of educational attainment. So the one difference between these 2 states was, in fact, in terms of the concentration of male teachers. It's much higher in Sonora. So in rural areas of Sonora, about 2/3 of teachers are male. But generally, we find that teacher distribution in Mexico is quite unequal. And many other things in Mexico are unequal in terms of income distribution, access to education, the allocation of resources toward education, and so forth. But what if we were to compare Mexico to a country that we think of as being more equitable, more equity that is seeking to provide equal opportunities for everyone? So the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development began an international survey in 2007 called TALIS, the Teaching and Learning International Survey. And in TALIS, there were, I think the first round, there were maybe about 25 countries that participated. 2 of those countries were South Korea and Mexico. So having studied Mexico, I wanted to compare Mexico to a country that, at least in my mind, and according to some limited evidence, had a much more equitable approach to allocating teachers. So with my colleagues Amita Chugar and Josh Rue, we did a study comparing teacher distribution in Mexico and South Korea. And what you can see in the first panel on the top left and in the bottom left we're looking at teacher education levels in terms of the percentage of teachers who have more than a bachelor's degree. And we're examining those teacher education levels across, first, community size in the first panel. So we're looking at what do teachers look like in villages, small towns, cities, and large cities. And we found that in Mexico, first of all, the first thing to notice is that teachers have much higher levels of education in South Korea relative to Mexico. The second thing is in Mexico, it's hard to see this because the levels are relatively low, but in Mexico, more educated teachers are disproportionately concentrated in large cities, which is kind of inequitable because the real disadvantage is concentrated in rural areas. In fact, the opposite occurs in South Korea, where the more educated teachers are disproportionately concentrated in rural areas. Now we look at the same question about teacher education at the bottom, but now we're examining levels of teacher education across levels of education of the parents. And as we move from left to right, we're going from schools with lower average parental education to higher average parental education. So we're examining what teacher patterns look like across schools with less educated parents and more educated parents. And again, we find in Mexico, more educated teachers working in schools with more educated parents, and in South Korea, we find the opposite. We actually find more educated teachers working in schools with less educated parents. We also examine these questions according to teacher experience. On the right, these two panels on the right, and we found similar patterns in terms of the percentage of teachers who had 20 or more years of experience. In Mexico, they're more concentrated in urban areas and in schools with more educated parents. In South Korea, they're more experienced teachers are concentrated in rural areas and in schools with less educated parents. So a really inequitable distribution arrangement in Mexico, but an actual equity-enhancing kind of a pattern in South Korea. So those are two countries, and by the way, one of the reasons we chose those two countries is that they both have relatively centralized systems of teacher allocation. So rather than teachers negotiating directly with schools or school districts, as in the United States, a more central authority decides where teachers will work. So that's an important consideration in the distribution of teachers. But we did find, because of this sort of commitment to equity and resource allocation, a big difference between Mexico and South Korea. Now, what if we were to, so that's a very unequal country and a much more equal country. What if we were to look at many countries around the world across, let's say, 3 different continents? My colleague, Dr. Amita Chugar from Michigan State University, and I conducted a study of teachers of marginalized children around the world. The study was funded by the United Nations Children's Fund, or UNICEF. And so we looked at countries in Latin America, we looked at countries in Asia, and we looked at countries in Sub-Saharan Africa using a variety of data sets. In Latin America, we use what's known as the CERCE, which is a data collection effort funded by UNESCO. In Asia, we use data from the Trends in International Math and Science Study. And in Sub-Saharan Africa, we use 2 data sets, one called PASEC that's applied in Francophone Africa, and SACMEC, which is in Anglophone Africa. And so we gathered a lot of data. I mean, these data were gathered by these international organizations. We did a lot of analysis. We were looking at over 20 countries, many different variables, different characteristics of teachers. So we really struggled with how are we going to demonstrate evidence with all of these variables and countries and questions and different student characteristics, different teacher characteristics. So we did what any good researcher does. We asked our graduate students, can you think of a way that we can display all of these data in a way that's really understandable to a policy audience, for example? So our graduate students did come up with a really interesting and I think fairly intuitive way to display these data, and I'll try to walk you through this graph. So this represents one model country that's, by the way, an inequitable country. Along the top, you have student characteristics. We're looking at differences between students with high and low math score, high and low socioeconomic status, high and low mother's education, and whether they speak the language of the test at home or not. And if they don't speak the language of the test at home, in many countries, particularly in Latin America, if they do not speak the language of the test at home, that probably means they're an indigenous child. So they speak an indigenous language rather than Spanish, for example. Along the bottom, these are all teacher characteristics. The bluish characteristics are more kind of demographic variables related to age, experience, whether the teacher is a male. The green are education and training. And then these orangish are more related to kind of teacher satisfaction and teachers, more qualitative sorts of attributes of teachers. And then what we did is we compared means of teachers who worked with different types of students. And so these bars, you see the zero line there. If teachers were allocated totally randomly or uniformly to schools or to students, we would really see clustering along that zero line. But if we see a lot of bars below the line, that means there's an inequitable distribution because there are teachers with what we consider to be important positive attributes who are more disproportionately concentrated with more advantaged children. So you can see in a situation like this, it's pretty uniformly an inequitable situation for marginalized children in terms of their access to teachers. Now, we did this analysis, as I mentioned, in Asia, and good news for all of you, the most equitable of the countries that we found was actually, or the most equitable of the education systems we found was Hong Kong. You can see that in many cases there are actually more experienced teachers tend to be working with less advantaged students. The only exception for the most part is kind of these orange variables where teachers working with less advantaged students are reporting more difficulties with school climate and working conditions. On the opposite side, in terms of equitable distribution, we find Indonesia, where it's pretty consistently inequitable in terms of who's teaching with what students. And it's not surprising if you consider the geography of Indonesia, an enormous archipelago with vast, remote, rural expanses. In fact, in Indonesia, there tend to be surpluses of teachers in urban areas, but shortages in rural areas. So there are many schools remote schools where it's very difficult to recruit teachers. In the middle, you can see we found, in terms of equity, we found Malaysia, Taipei, and Thailand, and Mongolia is similarly inequitable, similar to Indonesia in terms of equity. So our findings from this quantitative cross-national study, we really found compelling, systematic, cross-national evidence of an unequal teacher distribution. We found pretty consistently that teachers of marginalized children, depending, no matter what dimension of marginalization you examine, tend to be male, younger, less experienced, and less qualified. Teachers of marginalized children are more dissatisfied, and they're more likely to express a desire to be reassigned to a different school. This problem of teacher sorting is particularly pronounced in terms of teacher test scores in Sub-Saharan Africa. In the SACMEC data in Sub-Saharan Africa, we actually had measures of teachers' performance on tests, and we found a lot of inequity in the distribution of those measures, as well as in teacher preparedness, which is a question that TIMS asked, the Trends in International Math and Science Study. But overall, we found that Asian countries tend to have more equitable patterns, and this could be due to generally higher average levels of teacher preparation or stronger requirements to become teachers, or just a greater status of the teaching profession that encourages more young people to go into teaching. But lest you think that there are no problems in Asia with teacher distribution, in 2013, TALIS did it. There was a new round of TALIS, and this time, unlike the first round, the United States participated in TALIS. And I had a colleague visiting me from South Korea, Dr. Dongwook Jang from Seoul National University, and we decided, hey, let's do a comparative study of South Korea and the United States. Now the United States is participating. We can look at teacher distribution in the United States. And of course, we anticipated big differences in terms of the distribution of teachers. And for the most part, across schools, we were right. This is we made what's called a Gini Index, which is a measure of inequality. It's a measure of to what degree students share in a particular teacher characteristic across classrooms. And we looked at several teacher characteristics, including years of teaching, permanent employment, whether the teacher is out of field, if they're teaching in a subject they didn't study or didn't get a degree in, and self-efficacy. And what you can see is, across schools, a higher level means more inequality. So in the United States, yes, we did find more inequality in teacher distribution in most of these measures. But then we also looked across classrooms, and we found much higher levels in South Korea and in the United States in terms of teacher characteristics. So even if South Korea seems to have done a good job of providing equitable access to qualified teachers across schools, there appears to be a problem still across classrooms in terms of who's teaching marginalized children. So that brings us to, what do we know about this problem in terms of what causes it and in terms of what might remedy this unequal distribution of teachers? And here unfortunately, I don't think there's as much evidence as we would like. But let's look to the research evidence in terms of what actually causes these opportunity gaps in children's access to qualified teachers. So in the United States, a lot of the literature is about teacher preferences. What kind of students do teachers like to work with? And where do teachers like to be? Because again, in the United States, if I'm a teacher and I have if I've been trained in a great university and I have a stellar record in terms of my work experience or in terms of my academic background, I have kind of a lot of choice. And I can negotiate with schools, I can negotiate with districts, and I can perhaps call up a principal, and if the principal likes me, the principal will call up the district office and say, I want this teacher, hire this teacher. So preferences are really important in this situation, because those with greater qualifications can exercise their preferences. But this might not be the same in many other systems that are more centralized, like the Korean system. So there was an article in the Educational Researcher arguing that equitable access to qualified teachers in South Korea is due to, one, uniformity and quality, kind of everyone is well prepared and everyone is a very well qualified teacher. They also rotate teachers. Teachers must rotate to new schools every 5 years in order to avoid the situation where the most qualified teachers are all concentrating in certain schools, which tend to be schools with more advantaged students or more pleasant working conditions. And there are also quite a few incentives in place to teach disadvantaged children in South Korea. So I've done a lot of related research in Latin America, and I find exactly the opposite. In Latin America, it almost seems like the system is designed to promote inequity. So in many Latin American countries, so this study in particular is about Uruguay, but this happens all across South America and parts of Central America as well. Teachers take a test after completing their teacher preparation program, and then the highest scoring teachers get to choose their schools. So you can imagine what schools they choose, right? The highest achieving schools, the schools in the nice areas of the city, schools in urban areas. So it's almost like this is designed to promote inequality. In our paper comparing South Korea and Mexico, we argued that all else equal, a more centralized system with a greater commitment to equity will have more equal teacher distribution, because education officials with equity in mind can really look across the system to see where the needs are and assign teachers accordingly. So there was a study that from Washington State in the United States. They found unequal teacher distribution across several dimensions of teacher quality and of student disadvantage. But they argue that these gaps may result from teacher preferences, collective bargaining agreements negotiated by unions, teacher unions, by the assignments that principals were making, or student tracking. And this is very common in the United States, both within schools and across schools, where the higher achieving students tend to be tracked into one kind of set of curriculum and types of teachers, and the lower achieving students are tracked into quite another curricular and academic environment. So, to my knowledge, really no studies have yet kind of tested policy variables to see how they're related to this problem of teacher distribution. So my colleague and I, Professor Zhang from Seoul National University, then in another article, a cross-national study, tested some policy variables to see how they correlated with teacher sorting. And we found that in particular, cross and within school grouping of students tends to be strongly correlated with teacher sorting in ways that are kind of reduce equity in children's access to qualified teachers. And I'll return to that study in a few minutes. But first of all, I want to say that some of you out there might be qualitative researchers saying, wait, what's up with all these econometric studies? Why don't you just go into the schools and the school systems and find out what's happening through case studies and qualitative research? So we did that. We, through our UNICEF work, we also did case studies of teacher distribution in 3 countries, in India, Mexico, and Tanzania. In each of these countries, we chose a collection of different states or provinces that were higher achieving, lower achieving, kind of in the middle, and also states that had particularly important populations of marginalized children. For example, in Mexico, we looked at the states of Chiapas and Yucatan, which both have large concentrations of indigenous children, many of them the descendants of the Mayas, of the Mayan civilization. So we found similar results in these 3 countries, of course, some interesting differences. I'm just going to share a few quotations illustrating this problem in Mexico because some of these quotations, I was conducting these interviews in Mexico, and some of these interviews really struck me. So I spoke with a researcher in Mexico City who had years in education policy and educational research. She told me marginalized children who represent the majority of children in Mexico, most children are marginalized, do not have access to well-qualified teachers. The answer is maybe trivial, but there is no way, and the evidence is everywhere. A teacher educator in the state of Chiapas told me, we give the most difficult positions to the least experienced. So there's a program in Mexico called CONAFE where young people, 16, 17, 18 years old, go out to these very remote areas into communities that are not even big enough to have a school. But they teach in these little community schools for 18 months. They make an 18-month commitment. But they're young. They're fresh out of high school. And many of these teachers told me how difficult it was. So they're going out to these remote areas, oftentimes where they're afraid of either narco trafficking or wildlife even. They're worried about, animals. And they're teaching in some of the most complex and difficult environments you can imagine. Multi-grade classrooms where you might have children from 1st grade to 6th grade all together in the classroom. You might have indigenous children. So these are Spanish-speaking young people who are working with children who do not speak Spanish. Extremely complicated, complex teaching environments, and they are 16, 17 years old with very little preparation. A researcher in Chiapas told me the quality of teachers is a huge problem in Chiapas and in other parts of southern Mexico. The more marginalized parts of Mexico always have a problem that there are not any qualified teachers. And finally, a teacher in the state of Yucatan said the most unprepared teachers are sent to the highest need areas. But it should be exactly the opposite. We should really be sending our most skilled teachers, most experienced teachers, to work with those kids who are in multi-grade classrooms or who are bilingual or speaking other languages other than the instructional language. So our recommendations from this research is to ensure equity, transparency, and efficiency in initial hiring and transfers. A lot of this problem of inequity happens in teacher transfers because there's a lot of bargaining around who gets to transfer and where, and there's a tradition of, okay, I'm going to work in this rural area for a couple of years. I'm going to pay my dues, but over time, I'm going to build up credit to transfer to an urban area. We need to recognize teacher concerns. We need to actually talk with teachers to find out what their concerns are. We need to carefully design monetary and non-monetary incentives because teachers respond to both types of incentives. They really care, obviously, about salaries, but they also care about where and with whom they're working. We need to provide adequate and relevant teacher preparation and in-service training and support, especially in those complex teaching environments, for example, in multi-grade classrooms. Most importantly, we need to invest in local infrastructure, particularly in these remote and rural schools, where teachers just don't go because it's very difficult to live in these environments. And we need to invest in local human capital with a focus on girls and women. In most of these countries that we've studied, if you go out to remote rural areas, you find very few female teachers. And this is a problem for girls who are looking to female role models. It's also a problem for recruiting local teachers because there aren't enough females in the community who have a high enough educational attainment to become teachers. Finally, I want to look back at some cross-national evidence because this is starting to tell us kind of what sorts of policy decisions or policy actions we might take in classrooms or across education systems to address this problem of teacher sorting. And what my colleague, Professor Zhang from Seoul National University and I did was we looked at the TALIS data from 2013. And we did a lot of analysis of teacher characteristics and how teachers were distributed across schools and classrooms in these 32 countries. And what we did on the left side here, on the bottom, on the x-axis, we looked at how much teacher, we made this overall teacher quality factor combining several other teacher variables through principal components analysis. And we looked at how much that variable varied across schools. So how much does teacher quality, in terms of this overall measure, vary across schools, and how much does it vary within schools along the y-axis? And what we see is, as inequality increases across schools, for the most part, it also is increasing within schools. So we see that unequal systems tend to be unequal in more ways than one, both across classrooms and within classrooms. Now, do these patterns vary according to national income? Here along the x-axis, we have gross national income per capita, and we have along the y-axis, the intra-class correlation. In other words, what degree of variation is due to cross-school differences in this teacher quality factor. And what we see is, for the most part, a downward sloping trend, which means that as national income increases, the problem becomes more about inequality across schools and less about inequalities within schools. And you can see up here, these three countries, Mexico, Chile, Brazil. You can see this is a particular problem in Latin America in terms of teacher distribution across schools. A lot of inequality. It really matters who your teacher is in these countries because you might have a very different teaching and learning experience depending on what school you're in. So we did then examine correlations with teacher distribution patterns and some policy variables. So in terms of cross-school sorting, distribution of teachers across schools, we found that most importantly, cross-school ability grouping of students is positively related to sorting. So in systems that allocate students to schools based on ability, we're going to send the higher achieving students here and the lower achieving students here, that really exacerbates teacher sorting because now you're giving teachers even one more reason to choose one type of school or another because the schools look very different because the student populations are very different. How about cross-classroom sorting, this issue that teachers look different across classrooms within a school? We found some things that were actually negative related to sorting. Most importantly, cross-school ability grouping. If you track students across schools, within your schools, they might look more homogeneous, so there's less propensity to sort within a school. But also, if you do not use ability grouping within schools, that means your student populations across classrooms look more alike, so there's less for teachers to sort across. So there are more equal distributions of teachers in those schools that don't use ability grouping within the school. And we also found some interesting results related to financial bonuses for teachers and keeping track of data. Those are negatively related to sorting. Positively related to teacher sorting across classrooms, teacher incentives for career advancement. So those tend to exacerbate the problem of teacher sorting. So kind of accountability mechanisms or mechanisms designed to promote efficiency, we have to be careful because they might induce teachers to make decisions about where they teach based on these either incentives for career advancement or bonuses or something else. Public posting of achievement data and autonomy in curriculum instruction are also related to sorting of teachers across classrooms. So in terms of a summary of terms of this issue of equal access to qualified teachers across schools, one example is from Korea using policies like uniformly well-prepared teachers, mandatory rotation of teachers, and incentives to teach in difficult schools. Those things all seem to help with the problem of teacher distribution across schools. In lower income contexts, like the context we studied in our book, rural development is really important so that you can attract teachers to work in remote rural schools because the conditions are more attractive. But we warn that you must beware of unintended consequences. Policies designed to promote educational efficiency, like student tracking or grouping, teacher performance incentives, school accountability and curricular or instructional autonomy, may have unintended consequences in terms of teacher sorting. Whenever you design a teacher incentive program, you have to think about what will it actually incentivize? How will teachers respond to this? What do teachers care about? And are they going to respond to this incentive system in a way that we had not anticipated, like choosing to work in higher achieving classrooms or schools? And finally, how do we ensure access to qualified teachers across classrooms? And this, I think, is an even greater problem than the problem of teacher quality across schools. Although this is seems to be a big problem in most countries, the evidence base is actually very thin here. I know of maybe 3 or 4 studies in the United States and 1 or 2 cross-national studies. So there are 2 possible approaches. We can provide incentives or supports for teachers who work in classes with stronger concentrations of disadvantaged students. So we can say, okay, we recognize you have a really difficult class, but we're going to support you through professional development, a mentor, or something else. Or a more addressing the root cause of the problem, you can reduce within school ability grouping, do away with student tracking, which again is very common in the United States, to make classrooms more similar. If our classrooms look more similar, teachers will have fewer incentives to sort across classrooms. And also they'll have the advantage of lower achieving or more disadvantaged children will have the access of teaching and learning with higher achieving peers. But of course, as in any other question in education, much more research is needed. And if any of you are working on dissertations or trying to think of research topics, I think this is a great one, very unexplored, and in my opinion, very important for educational equity. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.